Shalom, family. I pray that all is well. I am back with another installment for the Enslaved, and this video is titled For the Enslaved. Valentine's Day was salt in the wound of the destroyed, scattered nation. In the early 17 to the late 1800s, by the date of February 14th, enslaved families were divided asunder, sold to the highest bidder only 4 weeks prior to the date. But before we travel down that lane, I discovered an interesting fact about Valentine's Day. Most cognizant adults know it's a commercialized, pagan-based, non-holy day. Valentine's Day, interesting enough, gained its origins from the belly of ancient Rome, supposedly after the murder of a saint with the same name. But the more interesting fact is not even the originators of Valentine's Day know exactly why the custom began. Let's read a question and answer article from the Pathfinder's question box, published March 14th, 1925. And it reads as follows. Origin of Valentine's Day. Question. I would like to know the origin and meaning of St. Valentine's Day. Answer. Saint Valentine was a Christian martyr who was put to death at Rome on February 14, 271 AD, according to the scant records extant. The custom of sending love messages and tokens at this time of year has no actual connection with the saint, whose name seems to have been introduced through some mistake. How this custom got started is merely a matter of conjecture. There was an old belief that on Valentine's Day, the birds began to mate. There was a custom among the Romans that on the feast of Lupercal, the sacred urn was put in some conspicuous place. In the urn were put the names of all the Roman maidens, and the youths would come there in search of sweethearts. One story unsupported by sufficient evidence has it that Valentine's Day was deliberately associated with this Roman love custom by one of the popes in the 5th century. The feast of the Lupercal, according to this story, was given a Christian name in order to lead the people gradually into Christian ways of thinking. Naturally, the custom survived the change of name, but the fact is the origin of the custom of sending valentines is wrapped in hopeless obscurity. It has been referred to in English literature since long before the days of Shakespeare. After reading this article, I was extremely amused because Christ clearly states the blind leads the blind, and both fall into a ditch. Moving on. The next informant is John W. Allen, author of the 1963 published book titled Legends and Lore of Southern Illinois. In his book, John W. Allen writes, the exchange of comic or mock valentines came into wide practice about 60 years ago. One year, about the turn of the century, the Chicago Post Office handled more than 1 million valentines, mostly of the comic variety. Remember that. Of those reaching the post office, 25,000 were considered to be unfit for transmitting through the mail. It must have been a field day for the postal workers inspecting them. In the same year, the post office at Philadelphia handled about 750,000. Anyone wishing to take a sly dig at another may still find old-time comic valentines for that purpose. So let's do the math. John's book was published in 1963. In that paragraph, he says, comic and mock valentines came into wide practice about 60 years ago. So that would be 1903. Now, What do you suppose a Valentine's Day card would resemble in 1903? Next article by Mrs. Stacy Patton. Miss Stacy Patton wrote an article for the Chronicle of Higher Education, February 14, 2012, titled The Darker Side of Valentine's Day. Northwestern University professor explores racist greeting cards. In the article, she captions this photo of the Valentine's card. It says, the Valentine's Day cards from the early 20th century that featured stereotypical images of black people were almost always written in a corrupted version of English. Kate Morrison, writer for MessyNessyChick.com, wrote a blog post called The Dark and Twisted History of Valentine's Day cards. She says, in the past, the cards weren't manufactured by or for the KKK. These were best-selling Valentine's cards available to the general public at local drugstores and general stores, popular until the 1930s. These cards kept the stereotypes of blackness alive in an era when racial caricatures were prevalent in ad campaigns across the board. They help us grasp just how widespread and accepted racism was in mainstream American culture. How the mockery, belittling, and dehumanization of Black Americans was so easily used as a form of entertainment and humor. How easily? That's my question. How easily? Let's ask John W. Allen again. The exchange of comic or mock Valentines came into wide practice about 60 years ago. One year, about the turn of the century, the Chicago Post Office handled more than 1 million Valentines, mostly of comic variety. Of those reaching the post office, 25,000 were considered to be unfit for transmitting through the mail. It must have been a field day for the postal workers inspecting them. In the same year, the post office at Philadelphia handled about 750,000. Anyone wishing to take a sly dig at another may still find old-time comic Valentines for that purpose. Okay. We get you now, Mr. John W. Allen. Moving on. Back to the initial main idea. Our beloved enslaved ancestors were rendered to the merciless slave masters who showed no love on February 14th. Anne C. Bailey enlightens us in her book titled The Weeping Time, Memory and the Largest Slave Auction in American History. On page 15, she documents, and I'm going to start in the middle of the article. A girl of 3 years and a baby, chattel number 75, only 1 month old, that Daphne was holding protectively in her arms beneath a large shawl. This simple act of maternal love provoked the most boisterous remarks. "What do you keep your nigger covered up for? Pull off her blanket." "What's the matter with that gal?" said another. Has she got a headache? "Who's going to bid on that nigger if you keep her covered up?" Asked still another without any regard for her newborn that had been born on Valentine's Day. "Let's see her face." Auctioneer Walsh had to repeatedly assure the boisterous buyers that there was no attempt at subterfuge. She was not an ill slave that they were trying to palm off as a healthy one, but that Daphne had given birth only 15 days before. For that, she was entitled to the slight indulgence of a shawl to wrap around her and her newborn baby to ward off the cold and the rain. With these assurances made, the bidding began, and in the end, Primus, who was a plantation carpenter, and Daphne, a rice hand, were both sold for $635. Their two small children, including the infant born on Valentine's Day, were also sold for the sum of $635 each. It's a lot, you guys, but I'm going to continue. No love was shown on Valentine's Day. No love was shown or given to Mama Daphne in that example. And none for her husband. Another example of no love shown or no love given for Grandmother Belinda, also known as Belinda Royale or Belinda Sutton, or simply Belinda. Belinda Royale was a Ghanan-born woman enslaved by Isaac Royale. On February 14th, 1783, Belinda, who was elderly at the time, petitioned the Massachusetts General Court for a pension for a half century of enslavement on a 500-acre plantation outside of Boston. She asked for an annual pension for herself and her daughter, Prine. Prine was said to be invalid. So I'm assuming back then that meant Prine possibly has special needs. She petitioned to be paid by the Royale estate. She served the Royales 4 decades and was elderly and without capital. Once she was free, Belinda Sutton petitioned the courts several times, only receiving 2 documented payments from the Royales. The first payment of an approved annual pension of £15 and 12 shillings. And the second payment was £2 and 2 shillings from a stepson of the Royale Irving heirs in December of the same year. No love. Lastly, Valentine's Day. With all the gift giving and card writing, at one point in time for the enslaved, this day was utilized to indicate their date of birth. Commonly, the enslaved had 0 documentation of their birth, month, day, or year. Valentine's Day was a go-to for enslaved people, seemingly because this day was possibly correlated with their last encounter with loved ones in whom they were snatched away from. One of the most famous enslaved people we know of, Frederick Douglass, chose this day as his date of birth. He knew he was born in February between 1817 and 1818, but he chose the 14th day as his date of birth because of emotional ties. What emotional ties, you may ask? Douglass says he chose the 14th day of February because it's the last day he saw his mother, and she gave him a heart-shaped ginger cake.